Our US-based SABC correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease was given one of the last interviews with outgoing UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. This comes before he leaves office at the end of the year. In this exclusive SABC News interview, various issues in international relations came under the spotlight, such as the crisis in the DRC, transitions of power in Africa, South Sudan and Syria.
The Secretary-General of the United Nations in one of his final sit-down interviews before his mandate expires on December 31st this year. I am now joined by Ban Ki-moon. Welcome to SABC News.
Great pleasure to see you. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you for the opportunity, Secretary-General. I wanted to start in the DRC and the attack by rebels on MONUSCO peacekeepers, particularly the South African contingent, in which one soldier was killed, two were seriously injured. Why are rebels continuing to flourish in the eastern DRC, despite this being one of the largest peacekeeping missions anywhere in the world?
I'm deeply saddened by the news that very brave South African peacekeeper was killed and two soldiers were seriously injured. I extend my deepest condolences and wish these injured soldiers will get recovered as soon as possible. Unfortunately, we have seen more than 100 peacekeepers died in the course of their very noble peace mission. It's been happening every year, and I sincerely hope that the people, concerned parties, will resolve all these issues through political negotiation. In the meantime, MONUSCO is firmly committed to preserve peace and stability. The safety and security of UN staff, including peacekeepers, is a primary priority.
UN peacekeepers, particularly in the DRC, just today are of course on high alert, given the fact that the incumbent president, Joseph Kabila's mandate expires today. Of course, we've been talking about this now for a number of months. We've seen tens of thousands of paramilitary officers and police fanning out across the streets of major centers due to concern that there could be violence against any extension in his term. How concerned are you, Secretary General, that we are again going to see the DRC enter into civil war?
In February, I visited DRC and had a meeting with the President Kabila. And since then, my special envoy and Security Council members and all of our senior advisors, including myself, have been urging President Kabila and the parties concerned to resolve all these issues through inclusive dialogue, wider and wider consultations. And last weekend, I had the telephone talks with President Joseph Kabila. And while I appreciate his leadership, but I also urged that this continuing dialogue should be further deepened in a wider way. And I also appreciate this dialogue mediation facilitated by CENCO, the Conférence Épiscopale Nationale du Congo. This will bring some good result. It's important that all the parties concerned agree for a peaceful and accountable transitional measures on the presidential election.
I mean, the situation in the DRC, you'll agree, comes within a broader context about the transitions of power in Africa. We've seen many of those actually happen. South Africa, Namibia, Mozambique, most recently Ghana. There is positive news coming out in terms of peaceful transitions from one party to the other. And yet we have examples like Burundi, the Gambia most recently, Gabon. Your message has been very clear over a number of months, but it doesn't appear that African leaders necessarily are all listening.
It's very unfortunate and sad that many African leaders are not keeping their promises to work within the provisions of Constitution. That is why last year and this year, during AU summit meeting in Addis Ababa, on 2 occasions, I have publicly stated and urged African leaders that when their constitutional term comes to an end, they should not arbitrarily amend the constitution. They should not cling to power. And I have been urging them that please listen very attentively to the voices and aspirations of their people and abide by these constitutional provisions. And unfortunately, we have seen several cases, even after my repeated calls. Even President Obama of the United States, when he visited African Union in July last year, he also repeated what I had already said.
But what do you make, Secretary General, of the argument from many African leaders that say, you know, this is Western interference in the sovereign decisions of our nation states?
Of course, any country, a sovereign country, has their own sovereign right to do whatever is necessary, but that should be based on the will of the people. It's not the president or leaders who change the constitution. Power comes from people. And this is clearly stated in all the countries' constitution. That's a basic tenet of democratic principles.
Secretary General, let's talk about the International Criminal Court and the withdrawals, or certainly the intention to withdraw from the Rome Statute. South Africa leading the way on that score. I understand that you were personally aggrieved by South Africa's decision in particular. Take us into your confidence. Why were you personally aggrieved by South Africa's intention to withdraw? And what did you say to President Jacob Zuma when you spoke with him on this issue?
I regret that such a very important country, leading country in African continent and also in the international community, has decided to withdraw from Rome Statute. Rome Statute and International Criminal Court is a centerpiece of international criminal justice. And South Africa had been participating in the negotiation process of this Rome Statute and was one of the staunch supporters of this international criminal justice, and one of the first countries to join this Rome Statute. In that regard, since according to this provision, there are still some time left, I sincerely hope that South Africa will change their decision and come back to return to Rome Statute. This will give a very important message. Recently, we have seen other countries like Gambia and Burundi. They have
Kenya and Namibia are also considering now.
But I'm not in a position to comment on this. I sincerely hope that the African countries will show their strong commitment for accountability and eliminating impunity.
Secretary General, you haven't said much about the fact or about the argument that African countries are making, that they feel that they are being unfairly targeted, that some of their commitments to the Rome Statute perhaps don't gel with other international commitments like the AU Constitutive Act. Do you believe that there is any credibility to the complaints that Africans have about the ICC?
I'm aware of the concerns and also some perceptions shared by certain African countries that this ICC is targeting only African countries. But if you look at the case which are pending in International Criminal Court, several cases were submitted by the African countries themselves. There are not many such cases that this was initiated by the court or some other countries. Therefore, if you really want to have some improvement of this system, then the proper venue is assembly of the state parties. And it would be much better to remain in the system if you really want to change the system or improve the working method of system, I'm urging again the South African leaders, President Zuma, to reconsider this decision.
Well, since you're talking about system failures, let's talk about Syria. As Secretary General, I don't think a discussion with you would be complete without talking about Syria. You've called it a collective failure. You've spoken about your personal heartbreak. And yet many would argue that on Syria there have been very specific actions by individual countries that have prevented this collective action that you seek when we deal with the Security Council. Is it fair to blame the collective when some would argue that individual countries are more to blame?
When United Nations, particularly Security Council, is united, we have seen that much, much greater and stronger support could be given. Unfortunately, we have seen so many occasions, so many times that Security Council has been divided among particularly permanent members of the Security Council. In that regard, it's quite encouraging that this morning, today, December 19th, Security Council has adopted a unanimous decision resolution by allowing the deployment of observers so that international community led by the United Nations can deliver humanitarian assistance and observe the situation there. This kind of unity of purpose is necessary. Just looking at what had happened during the last 6 years, so many millions of people have to flee their countries, and so many 100,000 people have been killed. And most of the infrastructures, water system and sanitation and hospitals have been destroyed. Then it's a very serious and heartbreaking scenes that we see every day. Children, boys and girls and women, and they are either being killed or crying for help.
But it speaks also directly, Secretary General, to the credibility of the United Nations, and you are the face of that United Nations, whether it's the Security Council that's not acting, the General Assembly or whatever organ, you are still a symbol of that represents the United Nations. Do you believe that Ban Ki-moon has hurt the UN's credibility?
It's very difficult to characterize it that way. It's a collective responsibility. All member states, particularly Security Council members, they have shown unity of purpose and global solidarity. I'm conscious of all this kind of criticism, and I'm willing to take that criticism and also responsibility. But this responsibility could be shared, should be shared by the member states, and particularly when some people like President Assad of Syria, he seems to believe that all these issues could be solved through military means. But as we have seen in the many hundreds of years of history, then military means sometimes may be necessary, but it cannot bring any sustainable solution of the problems.
But let me push you on that, Secretary General. You've called, for example, in the situation in Syria for ICC referral. In South Sudan, your Secretariat staff, including yourself, have called for an arms embargo. And yet you don't see the Security Council coming to the party in that regard. Do you feel that you're being undermined? Do you feel disrespected by the Council at times?
Member states, first of all, should respect the principles and goals and ideals of the UN's Charter. But often, starting from the Security Council, they have been focusing on their narrow national or regional perspectives and interests. That is why we have seen many divisions. Syrian people are divided into largely two groups. But even the Syrian armed groups are divided into many different groups, almost uncontrollable, without any chain of command. The regional powers have been divided, and Security Council have been divided. That has provided perfect storm and perfect ground where ISIL and extremists could set their roots deeply. It's important to eradicate and defeat this extremism and terrorism by military means, whatever means required, in the name of humanity. But at the same time, military means is not the only way. There should be an inclusive political dialogue so that we can find transitional government with the full authority on security and intelligence.
You've had 3 special envoys. I mean, does this perfect storm leave the UN less powerful in this conversation?
Yes, of course. I have appointed the #1 top world's
Right.
diplomats, negotiators, including my predecessor Kofi Annan, Lakhdar Brahimi again, and Stefan de Mistura. It's not because of the lack of diplomatic skill. It's because of lack of global solidarity, lack of compassion for humanity. And why this situation should continue like this way, why so many people should be left homeless or should be killed because of some very narrow personal interest.
Secretary General, let's touch on development. Just a couple of questions before I let you go. Among your accomplishments, and you can agree or disagree with me, is the SDGs, the Paris Climate Change Agreement. You recently spoke about how these agreements, particularly climate change, were unstoppable, despite the election of Republican skeptics to high office in the United States. What's your message to a Trump administration, an incoming Donald Trump administration, particularly on the question of climate change?
On November 11th, just 3 days after his election, I have spoken over the phone with President-elect Donald Trump. We discussed the issue of climate change and many other important issues. I believe that as a very successful global business leader, now he's going to be a very important political leader of the United States. He has already seen the force in the market, how business are now being operated. It's not only the government, the business CEOs, and it's not only business CEOs against government, it's the people on the ground, the civil society. They all demand that the government must lead this campaign, and particularly the United States and China, to make sure that this world is environmentally sustainable, reducing global temperature rise below 2 degrees, and if possible down to 1.5 degrees. Many business CEOs have already retooled their business operations. Many important and big provinces and cities like California and Los Angeles and Nashville and Las Vegas, and many big business companies.
So you should get on the train.
They have changed low carbon economy, decarbonizing their business operations. That's the answer. I'm sure that, and also I'm hopeful that President-elect Mr. Donald Trump will understand this unstoppable trend of international community. Yeah.
The train has left the station and he might as well get on board.
Of course.
I know, as a final question to you, a departing shot, I know you're reluctant to talk about your future plans, so I'll ask you this. After decades, Secretary General, in public life, 10 years in this office, what many argue is the toughest job in the world. Why wouldn't you say that at 72 years old, I've done my bit, I want to enjoy the rest of my life without the stress of politics? Why not just retire?
That is my personal wish. But sometimes, as a public servant, when your expertise or experience or your vision are required by your community or by in any way, then you should be prepared to provide what you can do for your family, for your country, for your community, or for the world. So I'm open to all these options as former Secretary General of the United Nations. And it has been a great privilege to serve this great organization working for international peace and security and development and human rights, and also meeting so many different type of people around the world, not to mention presidents and prime ministers and ministers, but business communities and just the civil society leaders and many people of a vulnerable group of people. Those are all our family members of international community. So I'm willing to do anything which may come in the future.
Well, we thank you so much, and we wish you everything of the best, Secretary General. No matter what it is you decide to do, we'll be watching very, very closely. Thank you, and all the very best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
The 8th and outgoing Secretary General of the United Nations, his term mandate ends on December 31st this year. And of course then Portugal's former Prime Minister Antonio Guterres, also of course the former High Commissioner for Refugees, will take the reins here at the United Nations.